Hey guys, tonight we drift gently into a world of flickering hearth fires, wooden bowls, and the haunting aroma of yesterday's barley reheated for the fourth time. You're standing in a peasant's cottage somewhere in 13th century England. The thatched roof is holding for now, and smoke curls lazily from a stone hearth where a blackened pot bubbles with something vaguely edible. You've had a long day in the fields, your hands ache, your back is made of twigs, and now, dinner. You peer in. It's barley porridge. Again. Not the sweet, golden oatmeal you might dress up with brown sugar and cinnamon in the modern world. No, this is barley, roughly ground and boiled until it becomes a gluey, grayish lump. You poke it with a spoon. It pokes back. There's a splash of goat's milk stirred in, if you're lucky, and maybe a bit of honey, if you didn't already trade it away for a new bootstrap last week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments so we can see where our sleepy little village stretches across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You scoop up a spoonful and taste. It's warm. That's about the best thing going for it. It fills the belly, sort of coats the ribs from the inside out, and doesn't require teeth, which is good because dentistry hasn't been invented yet, and your molars feel more medieval than your dinner. Barley was the lifeblood of the lower classes. Wheat? That was for lords and their dainty manor tables. Barley was cheaper, tougher, and far less glamorous. It didn't rise well, didn't bake pretty, and often came with a bonus helping of stone grit from less than perfect grinding. If you thought your oatmeal had texture, medieval barley porridge came with the satisfying crunch of potential dental damage. This dish, also called frumenty, when dressed up for rare holidays, was as constant as the sky. Morning, noon, and night. Boil water, add barley, maybe toss in a scrap of wild garlic or nettles for something resembling flavor. Sometimes it was eaten cold. Sometimes it congealed into a solid brick that could double as a weapon or building material. Multitasking, medieval style. Yet barley had its virtues. It was hardy and could grow where wheat wept. It didn't ask much from the soil or the farmer. And it kept people alive. Barely, but alive. Historians still argue whether barley porridge was eaten more often by necessity or habit. Some say it was all people had access to. Others believe it became tradition, a weird kind of culinary Stockholm syndrome. You grow up eating something every day of your life. You start to defend it. Oh no, I like it this way, you insist, while quietly sobbing into your wooden bowl. There's even an obscure folk belief that barley porridge improved night vision, a useful idea if you lived in a one-room cottage lit only by a flickering tallow candle. Whether or not that's true, no one back then had the spare coin to test the theory under scientific conditions. In some regions, barley was fermented into ale instead, which, let's be honest, sounds like a better use of everyone's time. But when you're a peasant who hasn't tasted a fig since 1207, porridge becomes not just a meal, but a comfort. A bland, mealy consistency of plaster comfort, sure, but comfort all the same. You watch the fire crackle as your spoon scrapes the bottom of the bowl. That's it. That's the meal. Maybe there's a second helping if you're lucky, or if the neighbor he has sheep wandered too close to the garden and you struck a barter deal. Otherwise, it's off to bed with a belly full of beige paste and dreams full of chickens you probably don't own. And in the morning, barley again. If anything, it's slightly thicker from sitting overnight. If you're really fortunate, there's a crust at the edge that you can peel off and chew slowly, pretending it's something better. Toast, maybe. Cake if you're feeling especially delusional. It's oddly soothing, this life. Simple. Predictable. Sure, there's always the risk of famine, plague, or stepping on a rusty nail and never walking again. But dinner is dependable. It may not be joyful, but it will be there. And really, isn't that what sleep is for? You wake up to the pale light of dawn, cold seeping through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. Your breath fogs in the air. The fire has gone out. Again. You shuffle over, still wrapped in your wool blanket that smells a bit too strongly of sheep, and you stir the pot hanging over last night's coals. The porridge has solidified into something between medieval insulation and low-grade masonry. You scrape it out anyway, but today there's bread. Not the fluffy golden kind from a Parisian bakery. Not even the slightly stale sandwich loaf from your local store. No, this is rye bread, dense enough to hurt someone, sour enough to offend your great-aunt, and dark as the inside of a chimney. You break a piece off the loaf, which doubles as your plate and your napkin. It's heavy in your hand, moisture-resistant, structurally sound. You could shingle your roof with it in a pinch. This, for all its challenges, is a treasured staple in your diet. Rye grew in colder climates where wheat simply gave up. It handled the damp, the frost, and the unrelenting medieval drizzle with a grim sort of optimism. And unlike barley porridge, it could travel, if you didn't mind gnawing on something akin to a savory brick. Historians still argue whether the peasants of northern Europe preferred rye by choice or by the cruel geography of their land. In truth, there wasn't much choosing. Wheat was expensive. White bread was reserved for the noble classes or clergy. You got the leftover flour, dark and coarse, often mixed with whatever else was on hand, barley, oats, or even ground-up dried legumes, giving the bread a texture best described as fibrous. Sourdough wasn't a trend. It was a fact of life. With no commercial yeast available, your bread fermented naturally. Sometimes it rose, sometimes it sulked, sometimes it grew things. You cut that part off and kept going. Waste not, starve not. And if the bread went stale, which it always did, you had options. Soak it in weak ale for breakfast. Crumble it into your pottage to add body. Or simply chew very slowly, contemplating the exact number of teeth you still have. What's more, bread wasn't just food. It was tableware. Your trencher was often just a thick slice of old rye bread used as a plate. After the meal, if you were still hungry, and you always were, you'd eat it too. If not, it went to the poor, the pigs, or the compost pile in roughly that order. There's something intimate about holding your meal in your hands like this. No packaging, no branding, just a slab of bread that looks like it's seen things and might whisper them to you if you listen closely. Sometimes a small bit of lard was spread on top for a hint of richness, though calling it richness might be generous. It added flavor, at least. Other times, the bread would be rubbed with a garlic clove or onion, more scent than substance like medieval aromatherapy you could chew. In parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, people added caraway seeds or wild herbs to their rye bread for taste. A medieval treat, you might say. Other times, things went wrong. Rye, if stored badly, could develop ergot, a toxic fungus with some deeply unpleasant side effects. Hallucinations, convulsions, a sense of floating or burning. It's the unintentional acid trip of the medieval diet. Some scholars even believe that outbreaks of dancing mania and mass hysteria in the Middle Ages may have been linked to ergot-contaminated rye. You came for a sandwich, stayed for the spontaneous jigging and plague-adjacent nightmares. Still, rye bread was sturdy, affordable, and fed whole families with just a few loaves. You could bake it once a week, and it would keep, hardening slightly each day until you could use it as a weapon against intruders or overly curious chickens. Tonight, though, you tear off a corner and dip it into a bowl of warm pottage. The sourness of the bread cuts through the bland stew. For a moment, you almost enjoy it. The chew slows your thoughts. The weight in your belly is a quiet reassurance. Bread like this is rarely found today, not unless you go hunting for it at a farmer's market booth run by someone named Greta, who mills her own flour and hand-carves her loaves into little edible sculptures. But back then, rye bread was the taste of survival, bitter, dense, and relentless. And tomorrow morning, when the barley porridge stares at you again from its familiar cracked bowl, the memory of this bread will comfort you just a little. It was something solid, something sour, something real. You've just come back from hours in the field, your tunic soaked with sweat, feet caked in mud, and your stomach sending out warning gurgles like an approaching thunderstorm. You're ready for something hearty, something that warms from the inside out. You lift the lid off the communal pot and inhale. Ah, yes, pottage. You already know the smell. Earthy, faintly green, and somehow watery. It's not soup, it's not stew. It's pottage, the medieval meal that defies classification and expectations alike. Think of it as culinary improvisation. 1 part boiling water, 1 part whatever you could dig out of the ground or talk someone into trading. The base is often cabbage, or perhaps leeks if you found favor with the vegetable gods. On lucky days, there's a handful of beans, a turnip, or some wild greens. And if it's an extraordinary day, maybe a sliver of bacon rind, floating like treasure on a tide of overcooked kale. This dish was the centerpiece of most peasant meals, bubbling endlessly in iron cauldrons over smoky hearths. Left on the fire day and night, it evolved constantly. Add to it, stir it, forget about it. Come back hours later. The flavor, mostly steam and hope. Historians still argue whether pottage was more ritual or more necessity, whether it was treasured for its flexibility or simply tolerated as the only affordable thing that could fill a wooden bowl. And yet, for all its formlessness, pottage had rules. The cheapest versions were thin, cabbagey broths with nothing more than herbs and grain thickener. Barley, oats, or even crumbled bread were stirred in to bulk it up. The consistency ranged from soupy oatmeal to swamp. On occasion, pottage was spiced with garlic, wild onion, or the ever-controversial pennyroyal. Some scholars suggest this minty herb doubled as a seasoning and a contraceptive, although we'll never know how many pregnancies it actually prevented or whether it just made dinner taste like cough drops. Now and then, pottage played host to a bone. Not meat, just a bone. A gnawed one, boiled for its ghostly essence, maybe handed down through the generations like a treasured family heirloom. You'd fish it out, sniff it reverently, and drop it back in. Still, when you're that hungry, even warm water with leaves can feel luxurious. Pottage was adaptable. If you had peas, it became pea pottage. If you had beets, it turned reddish and vaguely optimistic. In winter, it grew paler, rootier, more introspective, like stew with seasonal depression. A thick chunk of rye bread or oat cake usually made its way to the edge of the bowl, perfect for dunking. Some peasants crumbled stale bread directly into the pot to soak up every last bit. Waste was unthinkable. Every crumb a small victory in the daily struggle not to perish from sadness and scurvy. And yes, there were feast day pottages, versions laced with lentils, herbs, even eggs or bits of salted fish. But these were rare, like solar eclipses or a day without back pain. Most of the time, you returned to the dependable green-gray slush with its aroma of boiled dreams. Still, there was pride in it. A good pottage maker, usually someone's mother or grandmother, knew how to time the vegetables, how to reuse old batches, and how to add just enough stale ale or vinegar to keep things interesting. Pottage wasn't flashy, but it cared. Some surviving recipes suggest variations like oatmeal and onion pottage, where oats added creaminess and gave the illusion of nutrition. Others recommend nettles and sorrel for vitamin C. In spring, dandelion leaves might bring a pleasant bitterness to the pot. You didn't need much, just a sharp knife and the ability to recognize edible plants before accidentally poisoning your entire household. Scholars still debate the origins of certain regional pottages, such as Scotland's brose or Wales's caul. Are these just fancy names for glorified peasant slop, or do they represent cultural pride dressed in turnip clothing? There's something oddly comforting about how unchanging it all is. You stir the pot, same as your great-great-great-grandmother did. You taste it, frown slightly, add a little more salt, or whatever passes for salt in your corner of the medieval world. Maybe ashes from the hearth, if we're being honest. You sit down with your bowl, cradle it in your hands, and take a deep breath. It's hot. It's filling. It's something. And in this world where life expectancy hovers somewhere between childhood and hopeful 35, that counts for a lot. So you dip your crust of bread, slurp the broth, and listen to the wind outside. Tomorrow might bring meat, probably not, but there will always be pottage. Your teeth still ache slightly from last night's brick-hard rye crust, but the morning calls for something gentler. Not soft, exactly, but less combative. You squat by the hearth, stir the pot, and greet the humble grain that's about to become your breakfast, lunch, and possibly dinner. Barley. Now, barley doesn't have wheat's elegance or oat's cozy charm. It's chewy, plain, and slightly bitter. But in your world, barley is the steady companion that doesn't leave when times get lean. Which is always. Barley doesn't demand much, just soil, rain, and an extremely low opinion of itself. You measure out a cup, not with a measuring cup, don't be silly, but with your hands, cracked and stained with work. Into the pot it goes with water and a pinch of salt. You stir slowly. The fire sputters. The morning stretches. This meal is barley gruel, the medieval answer to, what can I eat that feels like eating without involving any actual flavor? A thin, watery cousin of porridge, gruel was often served to the sick, the young, the old, or anyone needing something vaguely edible that wouldn't require chewing or dignity. It's bland, but it's warm. And warm in this damp, drafty cottage counts for a lot. Historians still argue whether gruel should be considered a separate meal or merely a state of being, whether it was distinct from porridge or simply a sadder, soupier version. Either way, you eat it, because it's here, and it won't fight you. Sometimes, if you were lucky, or your village priest has had a good week, you might get a bit of honey stirred in, or a handful of dried apples. In one of those strange intersections of the sacred and the hungry, church fast days often forced you to eat gruel anyway. You don't know if it's penance or just poor planning. Barley had a lot going for it. It was hardy and prolific, resistant to disease and friendly to the northern climate. You could plant it in marginal soil and still get a decent yield. That meant peasants could count on it, even when wheat fields failed or were swallowed by feudal taxes. It also doubled as animal feed, and just occasionally, when no one was looking, you might even ferment a bit into weak ale. Liquid bread, if you will. That same barley, once boiled and softened, could stretch into breakfast. Add a little milk, if your goat is feeling cooperative, and you've got medieval cereal. Add some herbs, and it becomes a broth. Leave it alone too long and it becomes wallpaper paste. Very versatile. And there were barley cakes, too. Flat, dry patties baked on hot stones or coals. They broke apart with a satisfying crack, but you'd want good teeth for them. Or at least one tooth with a sense of humor. Fun fact, some early barley recipes suggested mashing in wild leeks or even pig ass blood for added nutrients. Though it's hard to say whether this was everyday practice or just one of those medieval culinary moments born of desperation and poor lighting. You sit by the fire, bowl in your lap, and sip your barley gruel. It coats your mouth like warm sand. The steam fogs your face, softening the lines from too many harvest seasons and too few smiles. It's not joy, exactly, but it's not starvation either. And across the village in countless other huts, the same scene repeats. People sipping, slurping, sighing. It's communal, even if you're alone. Everyone's eating the same thing. No one's bragging about brunch. Sometimes, if a feast is approaching or the landlord's birthday is near, rumors spread. Of a communal dish made with barley, onions, herbs, and a shank of actual meat. You've never seen it, but you believe in it. Like a grainy unicorn. Scholars debate whether such barley-based feasts were common in village life or rare indulgences remembered too fondly in the writings of monks. Either way, you keep stirring. Hope, like barley, is hard to crush entirely. You spoon the last of the gruel into your mouth. It tastes like it always does, like survival. You rinse the bowl with a splash of lukewarm water and set it upside down on the shelf. There will be more tomorrow. There's something oddly grounding about it. Predictable. Humble. You don't need variety, not really. You need something that sits in your belly and reminds your body it has not time to die just yet. Barley does that. So you stretch your back, shake the crumbs from your tunic, and step outside to face the day. A day of labor, of damp shoes, of aching knees. But also, somewhere in the distance, the faint promise of hot gruel waiting for you again when the sun goes down. Because even in a world of plagues, famine, and crop failure, barley always shows up. By now, your stomach's settled into that medieval rhythm, always half empty, always half expecting disappointment. So when word spreads through the hamlet that someone's baking onion pie, you don't question it. You just start walking. Fast. Now, before your modern brain gets too excited, let's clarify. This is not a pie with buttery crust, caramelized onions, and flaky layers. This is medieval onion pie, which means it's more of a hope-filled vegetable stack in an edible bowl, seasoned with grit and maybe a pinch of salt, if luck has smiled upon the cook this week. The crust is coarse, made from rye flour or barley depending on what the mill had. It's not flaky. It's not golden. It's more like the edible cousin of a roof tile. You chew it because you must, not because you want to. Inside, layers of sliced onions, slow-cooked in their own weepy sweetness. Maybe a bit of egg was beaten in to bind things together, maybe not. Eggs were currency after all, especially when the chickens weren't cooperating. A sprinkle of sage or wild thyme might brighten the flavor, assuming the local goats haven't nibbled your herb patch down to dirt. Onions were everything to medieval peasants. They were easy to grow, easy to store, and somehow got more flavorful the closer you were to rock bottom. Historians still argue whether onions were the most cultivated vegetable of the Middle Ages or merely the one people wrote the most complaints about. Quirky side note: onions doubled as medicine. If you had a cold, a poultice. If your feet were sore, soak them in onion water. If your child was teething, an onion slice rubbed on the gums. There's no record of how well any of these worked, but they felt helpful. And sometimes that's enough. The smell of onion pie cooking was unmistakable, a mixture of comfort and armpit, sharp and honest. It wafted through open shutters, past ragged thatch and into the noses of villagers 2 houses away. If you had onions and flour, you were cooking. If you didn't, you were sniffing your neighbor's chimney and considering your chances of getting invited over. These pies weren't made daily. They were for moments when you had a few more ingredients than usual, when you could spare the effort of kneading, layering, and baking. Often they were cooked in a communal oven, or under hot coals with a heavy iron lid. You didn't just bake things in medieval kitchens, you committed to them, sweat included. You finally sit down to your slice. The crust breaks with a dusty crunch. The onions inside are limp, golden, and surprisingly sweet. There's no meat. Meat is for people with noble connections or extremely lucky trapping skills, but the richness of the onions almost fakes it. Almost. Some villagers added breadcrumbs to the filling to give it more body. Others claimed to stir in leftover pottage, yes, that again, as filler. A few ambitious cooks tried to layer in garlic if they could grow it or barter for it. The result? Onion pie that could clear sinuses 3 houses down. You eat it slowly, each bite an act of both sustenance and memory. Onion pie doesn't taste like celebration. It tastes like someone trying to pretend it's a feast, which in the Middle Ages is often the best you could hope for. And despite its simplicity, there's pride in a well-made onion pie. Some family recipes survived generations, passed down like spells. 2 onions, 1 egg, herbs from behind the garden shed, and crust that could stop a cartwheel. Scholars debate whether pies like these were ever considered fancy in their own time. perhaps served at low-tier feast days or brought out to impress a visiting friar. It's possible. But it's more likely they were just what people had. A way to make onions feel like a dish, not just a garnish to whatever your dreams were. As you finish, you wipe your fingers on your tunic and feel oddly satisfied. Not full, but fed. The pie sits in your stomach like a warm brick, offering more emotional support than caloric energy. And that's the magic of peasant cooking. You survive it, but you also feel a strange sense of gratitude for the chance. Even now, across time, you can imagine the smoke curling from those ovens, the firelight dancing on soot-streaked walls, and the quiet anticipation of a shared slice. Because even in a world where joy was rationed, onion pie was a bite-sized reminder that someone tried, and that somehow makes it delicious. Your breath still carries the ghost of last night's onion pie, but you don't mind. The day's beginning, and already your belly's asking for more. Not a feast, just something that isn't bark, moss, or regret. And so you shuffle toward a pot bubbling gently over an open fire where today's survival special awaits. Pottage. Yes, pottage again. You've eaten this meal so many times that you could identify it blindfolded, upside down, with one nostril blocked and a mild concussion. It is the mother of all medieval meals. A thick stew, a culinary shrug, a communal catch-all. Pottage isn't a dish so much as an idea. It's what happens when you toss whatever edible scraps you have into a pot with water, hope, and a long stick for stirring. Sometimes it's a beautiful, hearty stew. Sometimes it's beige sludge. Mostly, it's somewhere in between. You peer into the pot. A turnip floats near the top like it's trying to escape. Bits of parsnip hug the bottom. A few green herbs struggle for attention, and is that, yes, a dried pea or two. The broth is thickened with ground barley or oat flour. A little sour, a little salty, and entirely unpredictable. Historians still argue whether pottage was ever truly standardized, or if it varied from household to household like a culinary fingerprint. Most agree it changed day by day, depending on what you could forage, barter, or scrounge. Pottage might be cooked for hours or even days, literally days, reheated each time someone's hunger returned. The longer it simmered, the more it broke down into a flavor that can best be described as everything and nothing all at once. Some households kept a pot going endlessly. The French even had a version called pot au feu. Same idea, fancier name. In your hut, it's just the pot. Always on, always edible, kind of. Now the beauty of pottage is its flexibility. Got leftover bread crusts? Toss them in. Wilted leeks? In they go. Found a few snails or wild greens in the hedgerow? Protein and color. It's like soup, this weird cousin who shows up with a bag of surprises and refuses to leave. Quirky fact, some recipes included ale instead of water, especially if the water wasn't safe to drink, which was most of the time. The ale added flavor and made the dish mildly intoxicating, which, let's be honest, helped distract from the texture. Or the occasional rock. Flavor, that was optional. You might add salt if you could afford it, maybe a pinch of herbs, or a few pickled beets for tang. But more often than not, the flavor profile was boiled with a dash of yesterday. And yet, for all its grayish despair, pottage was loved. It fed the poor, the old, the young, the sick. It made no demands. It welcomed all ingredients and judged none. It was democratic, in a world that was anything but. You spoon some into your wooden bowl and notice a chunk of what might have once been cabbage, or possibly cloth. Either way, you chew carefully. That's the rule of pottage. Chew carefully and don't ask too many questions. Some families added a handful of dried beans, though they needed long soaking. Others risked throwing in bits of salt pork or fat, especially after a feast day or wedding, when scraps trickled down from the manor. The wealthier peasants, those rare unicorns with a second tunic or actual shoes, might even flavor their pottage with marrow bones. Rich, greasy, flavorful. A luxury, For you, a marrow bone is like a royal relic, talked about, never seen. As you eat, steam curling upward, your mind drifts. You remember your mother's version, always too thick, always a little burnt, but comforting. You remember the time someone added wild mushrooms, too many wild mushrooms, and half the village hallucinated a dancing pig. That was a good day. Pottage also served another purpose. It bonded people. Families huddled around it. Neighbors shared it. If someone had a better pottage that day, they might let you dip your crust in. That was generosity at its finest. There's even an open scholarly debate about whether regional varieties of pottage-shaped early local cuisines. Was Welsh pottage heavier on leeks? Did Northern English varieties lean more into oats? No one agrees, and no one wants to test it by living the experience for authenticity's sake. By the time you scrape the last smear from your bowl, you're not exactly full, but you're less empty, and that's the best you can hope for. You rinse the bowl, not because cleanliness is vital, but because dried pottage hardens into something that could serve as a roof tile. Later, if hunger calls again, and it will, you'll go back to the pot, stir, and see what it's become. Every time it's a little different. Every time it's still pottage. Like a peasant's life, it's simple, repetitive, and occasionally surprising. But somehow it keeps going. And so do you. There's a knock at the door, or maybe just the wind nudging the wood, and time for breakfast, which is to say, whatever's left. You tug on your boots, still damp from yesterday's dew, and head outside. The air smells like cold dirt and burnt straw. Classic, but someone's cooking barley gruel, and your nose is instantly on board. Barley gruel doesn't sound exciting. And, spoiler, it's not. But in a world without cereal boxes, Pop-Tarts, or anything even remotely resembling brunch, it's what you eat to stay vertical. You ladle some from a cracked pot into your bowl, hoping this batch was made with care, or at least with fewer weevils than usual. It's warm. It's beige. It tastes like damp wood with a personality disorder, and yet it fills you. Slowly, like packing mud into a sack. The texture is thick but pourable, more like a drink that gave up halfway. You sip it, not chew, unless it's an ambitious morning and someone snuck in a rogue turnip. Barley was the poor man's grain, easier to grow than wheat, tougher against wind and bad weather, and far less glamorous. Historians still argue whether barley's role in the peasant diet was out of preference or just painful necessity. Let's be honest, it's probably the latter. Nobody writes love poems to barley. Still, it kept you alive. It was used in bread, in gruel, and in ale. A peasant might eat barley 5 times a day in 5 different sad disguises. You could grind it into a coarse flour, boil it down, or even bake it into heavy, chewy cakes that doubled as weapons if necessary. Barley gruel was often sweetened if you were lucky. A drizzle of honey maybe, or a scrap of dried fruit. If you were rich in herbs, read, if the goats hadn't destroyed your garden, you might add a leaf or 2 of mint or sage. And then there was milk. Precious, rare milk. Most of it went to cheese or butter, but if a cow had recently calved, there might be a splash for your gruel. Just a splash, though. No one's making oat milk lattes here. You settle under a tree, spooning the gruel slowly, steam fogging your eyelashes. A few birds fight over something nearby, probably a worm or a half-eaten beet. The village is just starting to stir, but this moment, gruel and all, feels almost peaceful. You remember when the village elder told you, with a straight face, that barley builds character. Maybe he was right. After all, it takes a certain kind of person to keep showing up for breakfast when breakfast tastes like yesterday's laundry rinse. A quirky detail. In some regions, barley gruel was served cold. Thickened overnight, it would be scooped like pudding and eaten on the go. A medieval grab-and-go breakfast, if you will. The kind you could eat while carrying firewood and regretting your life choices. Some records show that barley gruel was even served to sick people as a healing tonic. It was easy on the stomach and full of whatever vitamins barley hadn't yet given up on. It was also served to prisoners, which tells you just about everything you need to know. Now and then, a neighbor might try to elevate their gruel. Toast the barley first for a nuttier flavor. Boil it in ale instead of water. Or, the holy grail, top it with a poached egg. That was a big deal. The kind of breakfast you might serve when a traveling friar stops by, or your cousin gets engaged, or the tax collector dies. Of course, not everyone had barley gruel. In coastal areas, people leaned more on fish stews or kelp cakes. In highlands, oats reigned supreme. But in your muddy little village, barley gruel is king, queen, and entire court. You scrape the last of it from your bowl and wipe your spoon on your tunic. It's still early. The gruel didn't excite you, but it didn't kill you either. And in medieval life, that's basically a 5-star review. What's more, your belly doesn't ache. Your fingers aren't shaking. You feel grounded. Grounded in the way that only bland beige food can make you. Firm, mildly depressed, and ready to shovel manure for 6 hours. There's beauty in that, in a way. A strange, gray beauty. Barley gruel reminds you that life doesn't always need to dazzle. Sometimes it just needs to work. And right now, it does. You wipe your fingers on your cloak and glance over toward the communal oven, the village hearth, where hopes and flour go in, and humble loaves come out, often a little too singed on the bottom. It's rye bread day, which is basically every day unless the rye crop fails, in which case it's hunger day. Rye bread is the brick of the medieval world. It's heavy, dense, and vaguely sour. You need 2 hands to tear it, and possibly a third for moral support. But you eat it because it's all there is, and because, once again, you're not trying to thrive. You're trying to not die. You lean against a fence post as someone slices through a new loaf. It resists the blade like it has a personal grudge against cutlery. The crust cracks, dark and rough like old bark, and the interior is spongy in a way that bread shouldn't be. But your mouth waters anyway. Historians still argue whether medieval rye was actually as hard and sour as some sources claim, or if that's just how modern palates interpret it. Either way, it was a staple among peasants from Germany to Scotland. Less fussy than wheat, more forgiving in cold, damp climates, and wonderfully indifferent to soil quality, rye was the crop of survivors. You tear off a piece. The taste is earthy, slightly bitter, with a tang that sticks in your throat. It was often fermented longer than wheat, giving it that signature sourness. If you're lucky, today's loaf was made with sourdough starter, a smelly, bubbling pet that lives in a jug on the shelf and occasionally tries to escape. Of course, flour was rarely pure. You didn't get your choice of stone-ground organic or gluten-free. What you got was ground rye mixed with whatever was cheap and available. Sometimes oat husks, sometimes dried legumes, sometimes dust that wandered in by accident. A quirky tidbit? Bread in medieval Europe was often baked with bread seals or carved wooden stamps that marked ownership. That way, when you shared oven space with 5 other families, you could reclaim your loaf and not end up with someone else's undercooked disaster. You think back to the last time the oven smoked so badly the whole village smelled like regret for a week. That was when old Henry used damp wood and blamed it on the spirits. You chew slowly, savoring the vague crunch of a barley husk. The crust is dry, but once softened with broth or ale, it becomes manageable, dare we say, comforting. Many peasants dunked their rye bread into everything. Ale, milk, stew, even boiled water, if that was all they had. You didn't waste bread, you just reimagined it. Rye bread was more than food. It was currency. You might trade a loaf for a dozen eggs or a day's labor. Some villages even paid tithes in bread. One particularly passive-aggressive tithe was known to be a single loaf, with a rock baked inside. Message received. And rye could also betray you. Ever heard of ergot? It's a toxic fungus that loves to grow on rye in damp conditions. Accidentally eat some, and suddenly you're seeing angels, or snakes, or angel snakes with long fingernails and opinions about your sins. Historians still debate whether outbreaks of ergot poisoning caused mass hallucinations in entire villages. Some even suggest it sparked witch trials. The line between cursed bread and a bad crop year was razor thin. Still, most years the rye behaves, and your stomach thanks you. It sticks to your ribs, fuels your legs, and silences the ache for a little while. You rub your hand across your belly, not in satisfaction exactly, but in temporary truce. Later today, you might grind more rye flour at the mill, if the wheel's turning and the rats aren't nesting in the grain bins again. You might knead another lump of dough, slap it into shape, and bake it on a hot rock if the oven's full. Or maybe you all just tuck the rest of today's loaf under your cloak and save it for dinner. Bread ages like a reverse miracle, soft to hard to weapon, but it's always edible. Ish. You eye a nearby child gnawing at a heel like it is a challenge from a tavern contest. They look proud. Chewing this bread builds jaw muscles you could use to punch through a wall. Still, there's something homey about it. It smells like survival. It tastes like persistence. Rye bread doesn't pretend to be elegant. It just endures. Like you. And in this world, that's more than enough. The sun is climbing now, a lazy crawl above the treetops, and with it comes the rumble of your belly. Not hunger exactly, more like its medieval cousin, mild dissatisfaction with reality. You wander toward the cook pit near the edge of the fields, where someone is ladling something brownish into wooden bowls. The smell hits you like a warm wool blanket dipped in salt water. Fish stew. Now, before you get excited, this isn't the seaside and nobody's tossing in fresh cod with a sprig of parsley. This is pond fish, river fish, the kind that look at you with too many eyes and taste a little like wet rope. You crouch beside the fire anyway, because it's hot and it's food, and you've developed a high tolerance for disappointment. The fish stew is thin today. You can see the bottom of your bowl through the broth. A few slivers of meat drift past, tiny flakes of perch, maybe, or roach. Someone added wild herbs to distract you from the truth. Possibly dill, possibly weeds. One never asks. You take a sip. Salty, slightly gritty, a hint of smoke. Not terrible, not good, but you've had worse. Remember the cabbage wine incident? Yeah, this is fine. Fish was crucial in the medieval peasant diet, especially during the 140-plus days a year when the church banned meat. That's a lot of Fridays and Wednesdays. And also Lent. Monks kept fish ponds for a reason. So did rich people. But you had the river. If you were clever, you set woven traps overnight or tickled the shallows at dusk to catch something wriggling. Historians still argue whether peasants truly relied on fish as a staple, or if it was more of a seasonal lifeline. In some regions, fish appeared daily, especially in marshy areas. In others, it was an occasional miracle that made its way into soup once a fortnight. The quirky part. Some monasteries got creative with their fish fasting. They classified beavers as fish because of their tails, and even considered barnacle geese fair game, birds supposedly born from driftwood. Peasant logic was more straightforward. If it moves and it's not obviously a demon, we'll boil it. You blow on your spoon and taste again. There's a root in this bowl, probably parsnip, soft and stringy, soaking up the flavor like a soggy sponge. Someone added wild leeks, too. They taste faintly of onion and bravado. The broth has been simmering since dawn, maybe longer. You catch a glimpse of a fish head bobbing near the surface, one cloudy eye staring at you like it knows. You nod solemnly. Respect. The bones are soft enough to chew. You do. Gently. Carefully. You're not in the mood to choke today. That's more of a Sunday activity. This isn't just lunch, it's a village affair. Families gather around the cauldron with crusts of rye to dip, with children trading bites, with a tired woman adjusting the pot's lid like it is her last line of defense. You see her stir in a pinch of salt she's been hoarding like gold. That salt might have come from 3 villages over, carried in a pouch sewn into her hem. It matters. It lifts the whole dish. Fish stew was flexible. The recipe changed with the seasons and the day's luck. Add milk if the cow gave enough. Add barley if you had extra. Add nettles, mushrooms, or wild garlic if you weren't afraid to poke around the underbrush and tempt fate. In coastal towns, they had mussels. In the north, dried haddock or stockfish soaked until rubbery. Here, you get swamp critters. You get minnows and the occasional rebellious eel. Not glamorous, but if you squint hard and hold your nose, it almost counts as cuisine. And you ate it with ceremony, even if that ceremony involved a shrug and a tired laugh. Because food took time, and time was currency. Someone fished, someone built the fire, someone stirred that pot until it reduced like a good sermon. The stew's warmth spreads through your chest now, calming and steady. It may be meager, but it's made by hands, you know, and that counts for something. You mop up the last of it with a crust of bread from your pocket, ignoring the lint. A fly hovers. You swat it gently. It dodges and returns. Medieval flies have no manners. You finish, full enough. Not jubilant, but quietly grateful. The bowl goes back on the pile. Someone will rinse it later in the river, which is also where someone upstream is probably doing laundry, or worse. You pretend not to think about that. The sun is higher now. Work calls. But your belly's not gnawing itself anymore, and that's victory enough. You rise, stretch, and glance once more at the fish stew, just a pot of odds and ends. But today, it kept you going, and that's all it needed to do. You trudge through the muddy path toward the field's edge where a squat, knobby plant grows in a scrappy patch. It's swede, that humble root vegetable no one brags about but everyone knows. Its rough yellow flesh hides underground, fattening patiently all season for the moment when you'll peel off its thick skin with a dull knife and tuck it into a pot. Swedes, also called rutabagas, were a peasant's best friend. They're hardy, grow well in cold weather, and store for months without turning to mush. You might have been tempted to think of them as poor man's turnip, but they're sturdier, more dependable, and if you lived through the winter on Swede stew and rye bread, you'd know that dependable is the nicest word for it. The taste? Earthy, a little sweet, and with the texture of a vegetable that's seen better days but keeps marching on anyway. You slice into one, the skin tough but forgiving, releasing a faint aroma of damp earth and resilience. Historians still argue whether Swedes were common across all medieval European regions, or if their popularity was more localized to northern climates where other crops struggled. Some medieval texts mention Swedes in passing, others never mention them at all. It's a patchy record, like the Swede fields themselves. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some areas, people believed Swedes had magical properties. Not magic in the sparkly fairy tale sense, but a more practical kind, like protection from evil spirits or warding off illness. If you ate your Swede stew by candlelight while muttering a blessing, well, maybe the germs didn't stand a chance. Or maybe it just tasted better that way. You toss chunks of Swede into the bubbling pot along with some onions and barley. The aroma begins to lift, a little sweetness mingling with the tang of smoke and broth. It's simple, unpretentious food, the kind that neither embarrasses you nor makes you long for anything else. You stir the pot slowly, noticing how the colors deepen as the Swede softens. Your stomach rumbles appreciatively. You remember the last time your mother scolded you for sneaking Swede before dinner, saying, "You'll ruin your appetite." Funny how those words don't seem quite so urgent now. Swedes were a staple, sure, but they weren't always loved. Their strong smell when cooking earned them nicknames like stinker or the peasant as perfume. Still, better a smelly meal than none at all. You think about the labor behind that pot, the planting, weeding, harvesting by hand, in rain or sun, with aching backs and calloused hands. The Swede didn't ask for much, but it demanded patience. And that patience paid off when the winter months dragged on, and the forests whispered cold warnings. Historians still debate if Swedes were considered a noble vegetable or purely peasant food. Some argue that higher classes dismissed them outright, while others suggest Swedes occasionally made it to feasts, disguised in richer sauces. For you, it doesn't matter. The Swede is the quiet hero of the kitchen, the root that kept you warm when the nights turned cruel and the pantry grew bare. You ladle a bowl of Swede stew, steam curling like ancient secrets from its surface. The first bite is soft, comforting, a whisper of the earth itself. You close your eyes briefly. The Swede doesn't pretend to be more than it is, and sometimes that's exactly what you need. Your fingers are sticky from the day's work, and as you settle near the fire you unwrap a small bundle. Pottage, the medieval equivalent of everything but the kitchen sink, stew. This isn't a recipe you find in cookbooks or fancy halls. It's the dish of necessity, of survival, bubbling quietly in a clay pot. Pottage is a thick, sloppy mix of whatever root vegetables, grains, and scraps of meat or fish you can find. It might include lentils, peas, cabbage, carrots, and if you're lucky, a bit of salted pork or smoked bacon. More often, it's just peas and onions, stretched thin with water. You dip your spoon into the dark, earthy liquid. The texture is somewhere between porridge and stew, with chunks that challenge your patience and flavor that whispers, "Don't expect much." But you're grateful. This pottage has fed countless peasants through lean times. Medieval households often cooked pottage in large batches, left to simmer for hours on the hearth. It was reheated multiple times, sometimes for days. Think of it as a communal potluck with only one participant. Survival. Historians still argue whether pottage was primarily a humble meal or a central component of medieval cuisine. Some argue it was eaten daily by peasants and nobility alike. Others believe it was more of a peasant fallback when nothing else was available. Here's a quirky twist. Pottage recipes were famously vague, because peasants didn't really measure ingredients. If you had peas and weeds, they went in. No weeds, no worries, add some tree bark or acorn flour. Yes, really. In one region, a variation called gruel was thinner and reserved for the sick or very young, while pottage was the hearty choice. The lines blurred often, depending on who was cooking and how hungry everyone was. You take another bite. The smoky flavor of the fire lingers in the broth, a reminder that fire was your kitchen's heartbeat. Without it, pottage would be raw roots and sadness. And pottage wasn't just food, it was culture. Every family's pot told a story of the seasons, the harvest, the hunts, and the random generosity of nature. It was the taste of place and time, soaked into your memories like a well-worn cloak. Sometimes you'd find a surprise, wild herbs tucked inside or a sweet burst from a forgotten carrot. Those moments made the daily grind a bit more bearable. As you eat, you notice a neighbor nearby adding ashes to their pot, an old trick to soften tough beans and speed cooking. You wrinkle your nose, but admit it's clever. And you remember that time someone tried adding crushed snail shells for calcium. The texture was challenging, but desperate times. Historians still debate how often medieval peasants had meat in their pottage. While the church's fasting rules limited fresh meat consumption, salted and dried meats made appearances on special days. But mostly it was vegetables and legumes. You scrape the bottom of your bowl, savoring the last drops. Pottage is the everyman's meal, not glamorous but relentless, like you. And after a day like this, that's all you need. The chill of evening settles in as you sit on a rough wooden bench, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke swirling around you. In your hands is a humble piece of black bread, dense, dark, and as heavy as a brick. It's been baked in the village's communal oven, a laborious process where everyone's dough shared the same heat and space. Black bread was the backbone of a medieval peasant's diet. Made from rye, barley, or oats, it was far from the fluffy white loaves favored by nobles. This bread was gritty, sometimes sour, and thick enough to double as a doorstop in a pinch. You break off a chunk, feeling its weight, and bite down. It's chewy, with a smoky tang from the wood-fired oven. You chew slowly, savoring every bit because wasting food wasn't an option. Every crumb mattered. It's not just food. It's a symbol of survival. Interestingly, black bread could sometimes be fortified with all sorts of things: bran, chaff, even ground nutshells when grain was scarce. It sounds unappetizing, but when hunger gnaws, you learn to appreciate texture over taste. Historians still argue about how widespread black bread was among peasants. Some suggest white bread was rare, but not unheard of among the wealthier commoners. Others insist black bread was the universal staple. There is a quirky tradition in some villages where leftover bread was soaked in broth to create a sort of porridge or thick soup base. Called trencher broth, it was a way to stretch every morsel of food. You remember hearing tales about bread so hard it could break teeth, or blackened crusts hiding soft, warm crumbs inside. It was the mark of a well-made loaf and a good baker. You lick the crumbs from your fingers, noting the bread's faint bitterness. It pairs well with everything else you have, from cheese to dried fish, or simply butter when the cow's kind enough to give some. Bread wasn't just food. It was currency, social glue, and a daily reminder of the harvest's fortunes. Every slice told a story of rain, toil, and hope. You glance at the communal oven, the fire now a dim glow inside the brick belly. In a way, that oven was the village's heart, baking more than bread, baking resilience, tradition, and moments of peace. As you finish your piece, a soft breeze ruffles the leaves. You sigh, full enough for now. Black bread, in all its humble glory, isn't just a meal. It's a legacy. You lean back against the cool stone wall of the cottage, the day's work done, and your stomach full of modest fare. Before you lies a small bowl of cheese, a simple yet precious treasure in a world where every bite counts. This isn't the fancy aged cheddar or creamy brie of today's fancy shops. No, this is fresh, crumbly curd cheese, made right on the farm from whatever milk the family managed to keep. Cheese was a vital source of protein and fat for medieval peasants, especially during the long months when fresh vegetables and meat were scarce. You break off a small piece and nibble it slowly, savoring the tangy, slightly sour taste that speaks of raw milk, summer pastures, and the labor of milking goats or cows by hand. It's surprising to think cheese could be so important when you imagine peasants surviving mostly on grains and roots, but dairy products offered crucial nutrition and variety. In some regions, peasants relied heavily on goats and sheep because cows were expensive to keep. Historians still debate how widespread cheesemaking was among the lower classes. Some argue that cheese was a common peasant staple, while others suggest it was more of a luxury item, produced seasonally or on special occasions. Here is a quirky fact. Some medieval cheeses were deliberately made with herbs or wildflowers added during the curdling process, giving each batch a unique flavor and, as some believed, medicinal qualities. You can almost imagine how the taste of nettles or dandelion might dance with the milk as natural tang. Cheese also had practical uses. Hard cheeses could be stored for months, even years, making them invaluable for survival during winters and famines. Some peasants even traded cheese at markets, adding a bit of income to their meager earnings. You dip your bread into a little whey left in the bowl, thinking about how this humble food connected you to the earth, the animals, and the seasons. It wasn't fancy, but it was yours. Remember that rough rye bread from earlier? Cheese made it a meal worth looking forward to. Together, they formed a balance. Bread gave you energy, cheese gave you strength. You chew thoughtfully, noting how the texture shifts from crumbly to creamy. There's a satisfaction here beyond taste, a comfort in simplicity. As you finish, you gaze out toward the darkening fields, feeling the weight of centuries behind every bite. Peasants may have been poor, but their food was rich with history. And as your eyes begin to close, you carry with you the quiet strength of that cheese. Solid, enduring, a small but steadfast friend in the endless night. The night deepens around you, a gentle hush settling over the village like a soft blanket. Your stomach is calm, the simple meals of the day wrapping around you like the familiar embrace of worn clothes. You feel the slow, steady rhythm of life, the breath of the earth, the warmth of the hearth, the patience in every root and grain. Remember, the food of medieval peasants wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, adaptation, and quiet moments of hope in hard times. Each humble meal carried the flavor of toil, the echo of seasons, and the whispers of generations who found strength in simplicity. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the soft crackle of firewood, the faint scent of herbs drying in the loft, and the gentle murmur of the night breeze through thatched roofs. Let the stories of barley porridge, black bread, and pottage settle gently in your mind, like a lullaby from the past. May you carry the patience of those who waited for harvests, the endurance of those who lived on roots and cheese, and the quiet courage of a people who made every bite count. Now, breathe deeply, soften your thoughts, and let the darkness take you, warm and full. Tomorrow holds new stories, but tonight you rest with the past, wrapped in the humble meals that kept the world turning. Sweet dreams.